We're talking about short games today. The impetus for this, the inspiration, was an interview with the founder of a new publisher called Oro Interactives, focusing specifically on these kinds of games. And it's really only tangentially about the interview. So before we even get into this, though, I want to make something very clear, something that may not have been clear based on many of the videos I've done before this. I don't actually give a shit about the business side of games. I don't care how many copies any game sold. I don't care about the revenue they've made or the number of people playing it, like their concurrent player base or their MAU or whatever. I don't give a shit about any of that. But the reason I talk about it, the reason I think it's important to talk about it is because nobody else is. Because all too often the discussion around small developers, independent developers, tends to be from the cheer squad. It tends to be the rah-rah stuff about how great it is and how indies are defeating AAAs or whatever else, which is giving at best half the story, is completely neglecting the struggles, the difficulties, the obstacles that these small developers have to go through. The risks that they take and the headaches they experience are just wiped out by this overarching narrative that just sees them as these, heroic, Davids beating Goliath over and over again. And that annoys me. I think you, as the consumer, should understand what it is that they have to deal with behind the scenes. I don't care what games made the most money. I mean, that should be clear from what my Game of the Year list looked like, for example. The most common comment I get, positive or negative, is from people saying, you don't talk about the same kind of games that everybody else does. And yeah, I don't. I don't care what's popular on Twitch. I don't care what sold the most copies last week. I like what I like. I like things that are interesting and original and fun and good. And that often has nothing to do with how much money that they've made. But I feel like I have to talk about the business stuff because nobody else is. But this time we're going to do something a little bit differently, because I could attempt to talk about short games as a business phenomenon, but we're going to skip through that pretty quickly, and instead we're going to look at them in terms of what effect they're going to have on the quality of the games going forward. Now, before I go any further, I want to set your mind at ease, because some of you may think you know where this is going. And just let me give you assurances right now. This is not going to turn into that stereotypical YouTube video where I spend the whole time complaining about the evils of capitalism. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to subject that to you. You've dealt with that shit enough in your life. Now, what I will, unfortunately, kind of flirt with, but briefly, is the notion of how monetary incentives can kind of change artistic incentives, how the two are very much in conflict. For example, the description of Oro Interactive on Steam says, we publish catchy, creator-focused games, basically suggesting that what they are looking for are games that are designed to attract the attention of Twitch streamers with scare cams. Now, I could say a lot of things in there about how this is a sign of the times, that we now concern ourselves a lot more with the marketing of a product than the product itself, but I'm not going to do that because you've heard that from everybody else. And the guy in question, Sam DeBeck, in this interview is pretty open with the fact that he is trying to chase trends, is just trying to be popular kind of at any cost. But my opinion comes across as a bit of a tool, but your mileage may vary. Maybe you think he's just being reasonable, and he does make some very good points here. Here, for example, is a quote that I find both smart and scary. There's a big shift happening in how indie games are made and released. Spending years and big budgets on a single title is just way too risky these days. Of course, some of these projects will succeed, and when they do, they're amazing. But the truth is, most of them fail. You're betting the farm on one shot. A smarter approach is to develop 3 smaller games over 3 years instead of one massive one. The market is volatile. Trends change fast. With 3 games, you give yourself 3 chances to hit, and even if none of them are breakout hits, you start to build compound revenue. If you've been following this channel for a little while, this may strike you as being pretty similar to the approach that Devolver is now taking. We looked over kind of Devolver's financial statements to their investors, and they are putting less money into their newer IPs because they are risky. Video games are an extremely risky investment right now, and when you are dealing with a risky investment, the best way to mitigate that risk is simply to reduce the costs that are going into it, which means taking less time to develop them. And this guy is suggesting 3 to 12 months max, and also putting less money into them. There's a lot of common sense here. Many of the developers I talk to for things like State of Indie are taking a really long time to develop their games. They have very, very long cycles, often, the better part of a decade. And sometimes that is because they have tackled things that are way too ambitious for them and then they don't work out. But honestly, a lot of the people I talk to are developing what seem like really simple games if they started off working on, something like a throwback JRPG or a side-scrolling beat 'em up, and they figured it would only take 12, 18 months, and it ended up taking 6 or 7 years. And that is a definite risk. There is a lot of good sense in, especially for solo and duo developers, for the smallest of teams, to start with really simple projects that they know that they can finish and that they know will generate some kind of profit. There is some logic to that. What concerns me is how tight the turnaround is and the expectation that you get it down this short. This idea that you should be taking 3 to 6 months, which is a really short period of time to develop all but the simplest games. That is what is kind of concerning to me. But really, what we have here is a possibility of things to go wrong if more people start to follow this advice. Now, there's been a definite trend toward things being shorter in this media environment. Within my own old field, fiction writing, you had things like flash fiction. They tried to bring novellas back. With internet video, obviously, we've got short form. We've got a transition from film over to TV shows. We've got songs are getting shorter on average. Kind of everything is getting shorter on average. And when you see this, there is always this knee-jerk reaction from people who assume that anything that is short or that takes a smaller amount of time to produce must be worse, must be inferior than anything that is longer or takes a longer amount of time to produce. This is the thick novel equals good novel theory of literature, and I despise it because it's bullshit. I have written over a dozen novels. I have also written dozens upon dozens of pieces of flash fiction, which are all under 1,000 words. And let me tell you, flash fiction is not easier just because it's shorter. It is a different style. It requires a different skill set. If you are trying to get all of the elements of an 80,000 word novel into 800 words, it takes a different set of skills. And if you don't believe me, try it. Tell me that it's easy just because it's short. I don't believe that something is automatically inferior because it's short, but it can be. It can be. And what I've kind of settled on is that it comes down to why it is that we're doing these things shorter. Are we doing them for creative purposes, for personal purposes, or are we doing them for pragmatic, some might call cynical purposes? Flash fiction is generally more of an artistic choice. There are some pragmatic reasons to do it. Most fiction markets pay by the word, so shorter stories tend to accept more of them, which means you're more likely to get into those publications, but then there are fewer flash publications, so it's kind of a wash. The people who choose to do flash fiction are doing so because they like the style. That's as opposed to music. Songs are getting shorter, let's be frank, so that they're easier to cram them into a TikTok. That's the reason why songs are well under 3 minutes now. The LP is gradually getting replaced by the EP with fewer songs, or even I don't know if I've ever talked about the infinite single model on here, where you're just releasing just one song after another forever. That's being done because it lets you get more out quicker, which has more to do with playing the algorithm, playing SEO than anything else. And it's not necessarily binary. There's a lot of space in between. I think short form falls somewhere in between. Because as someone who's tried to do short form and is not particularly good at it, it is one of those areas where it is a different skill set. But at the same time, let's be honest, a lot of people are doing short form video because it is easier and quicker, and they are just churning content. I used to write on Medium, and Medium has really gotten a bad reputation for that, among other things, is people just trying to write short, just creating these kind of stock articles that they can redo over and over and over again with slight variations. Why? Because they're primarily trying to get attention through an algorithm. Medium is actually a very close analog to YouTube in a lot of ways, and if you are working in an environment that is primarily algorithmic, it's a lot harder to break out when everybody is churning content. If you spend a lot of time really polishing up your work and making it all good under the impression that you're going to impress your human audience, you run the risk that your human audience never sees you at all. It just makes a lot more sense to do 3, 4, 5 articles a day. They might be kind of crappy, but if you do enough of them and they're at least mediocre in terms of quality, eventually one of them will hook the algorithm and you'll have some degree of success. And that is the logic behind a lot of this. So how does that apply to video games? Where is that? Is this more of an artistic choice, or is this a little bit more cynical? Well, my immediate gut instinct, and probably yours too, is that, well, even a short game takes longer to produce than something like a written article or a YouTube video, or even something like a song. So you've got to figure this is probably going to trend more towards the artistic choice side, because these people are still putting effort in. You know, we've looked at some really good short games, and we've things like the Duck Detective games. I reviewed both of those. Some of the short strategy games we've seen, Hexarchy, Yield, Fall of Rome, Nine Kings, all pretty good, all with meaningful effort behind them. We can see that pretty clearly. So really, I want to assuage another one of your fears. You may have heard me talk about the idea of churn and of games getting shorter and more of them coming out, and you may have immediately thought, oh no, are we going back to 2015? Is this going to be like an age of a whole bunch more digital homicides? No, these games aren't that bad. Even at their worst, they're not that bad. Yet. There is a risk of something like that happening. Because I do believe there are ways that you can not only reduce a game down to a formula, but down to a template. And once you've done this, it would be viable to put out a new game in a series every 3 or 6 months infinitely. And that then creates an issue, because the more of that happens, the more of these rapid fire small games that are coming out, it tends to kickstart an arms race, because that's kind of the situation we're in really across the spectrum. So far, we've kind of avoided that in video games, believe it or not. As bloated as Steam is, you know, things like Spotify is way, way worse. Orders of magnitude worse. YouTube is way worse. Everything is way worse. Video games are actually kind of doing okay here right now, solely because it is harder to make them. It takes longer to make them. But what if that changes? What if it gets to the point where people perfect kind of a template so they can make, 4, 5, 6 games in the same series a year? Then the issue becomes worse, because now you're dependent even more on those automated processes, which then kickstarts an arms race. It starts a feedback loop. Some might call it a death spiral, where the only way to stand out is to do the same thing yourself. But I don't want this to all be doom and gloom, because it is worth remembering that no matter what people may think, technology is not destiny, neither is economics, none of this is determined. The way I see it, there is at least one path through to the future where these small games are a significant part of, at the very least, the indie market. And in that future, that path splits off, there's a fork, and it splits off into 2 more roads. Now, down one of those paths, we have a future where shorter, cheaper games become an avenue for expression. They become an avenue for experimentation. They become a chance for developers to try things that might be a little bit risky if they were putting more money and time into them. And they become an opportunity for people to obtain games that respect their time, games that respect their budgets, and to just enjoy things the way we all used to. The other road leads to a future that is dominated by bad actors, that is dominated by people who are churning content, who are trying to manipulate the system, who are manipulating content creators and manipulating the algorithm and tricking people into buying low-quality games that keep getting worse and worse and worse all the time, and it completely crowds out anything that might be interesting, experimental, etc. I can't tell you which one is more likely to manifest. Actually, I would be interested in hearing your opinion on whether you think short games, if they do become more popular, will be overall good or bad for the industry. I would like to hear your take on it, because at the moment, I'm not sure. I could really see this going either way. And a quick update before I let you go. I have started shopping my latest novel around. I did mention I'd written a whole shitload of them. I have started shopping it around. As you can see, I've already gotten my first rejection, which isn't a great sign, but, whatever. The first one, it was going to happen. At the very least, a little bit of time passed. I think the first rejection I ever had for anything came in about 15 minutes, which means I got the rejection before I was done sending out all my queries. So it's at least doing a little bit better than that. Anyway, I would love to hear your opinion on, first place, whether you think short games actually are going to become a phenomenon that's worth talking about, and second, whether you think it's going to be overall good or bad for the system. I want to hear from you.